It's happening again. Everyone's dying around me.
We're the only hope of saving our entire race. There is no hope, Isaac. It is do or die. We're stuck without your help. Are you with me? Are you with me?
Ladies and gents, welcome back. I'm here with Dave Woldman from Visceral Games, who is the senior producer on Dead Space 3. So first of all, such an epic game, a monster of a game. How did you guys balance in the scare factor that everyone's come to know and love with Dead Space, with the franchise, but also add so much more to it in terms of story, weapon customization, looting, even a few new movement mechanics? How did you guys go about that?
You know, Dead Space, we've established who we are in the marketplace. When you say you're going to make a Dead Space game, customers expect some things right from the start: compelling, elaborate, deep story and characters, tension and atmosphere, scares, a heroic character. There's all sorts of things that go into what makes Dead Space Dead Space. And so when you set out to make a game like Dead Space 3, we have to take a long look at what's come before us. And part of the franchise, what we've established, especially through all the media extensions, is we have a very continuous, very specific fiction that we've grown, starting with Isaac on the Ishimura as a lone man thrust into a bunch of scenarios that trying to figure out what's going on, leading him down the road through Dead Space Extraction, through the animated features, through Dead Space 2, to arrive where we are in Dead Space 3, which is in some ways a very live, living world of fiction. And so the story and the structure that we've made for Dead Space 3 is a very logical continuation of these events. What happens when this necromorph outbreak becomes universe-wide, when other people are affected by it? You know, Isaac could no longer be by himself. He has to be interacting with other people who've seen these experiences, have their own perspective on them, and you know what goes into that. So when other people are involved, when governments are involved, when other societies, they're going to bring their own weapons to the table. They're going to bring the things that they're familiar with fictionally to the table. And so what we try to do in Dead Space 3 through the weapon crafting, as you mentioned, the movement mechanics, through co-op, is to try to infuse our story with all of these gameplay elements that from a storytelling standpoint makes a lot of logical sense. That you could say, all right, I understand that these people have seen it, this guy has a history with it, and it's easier to accept introducing these elements into your game when your fiction is consistent and it all makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, with sticking with Isaac for a bit, you mentioned, like, obviously he's a main thing throughout the franchise. In a way, we've kind of seen him grow through the 3 games. I mean, what little I've played of this one so far, but in the first one, he didn't even talk. And then the next one, we saw him come out a bit more, and now we're seeing a lot more. Was that sort of driven by you guys exploring the character, or was that, again, back to a story sort of thing?
It's one of those interesting things, because when Dead Space began, he was an everyman engineer thrust into crazy situations, and by growing the character over time, you have to say, is his reaction to these scenarios plausible? Is there something that he's doing that makes sense? And having gone through it once, it just wouldn't make him a lot of sense if in the 3rd game he's still saying, what's going on over here? What's the cause of this? Anyone who is familiar with our franchise and our fans love it and eat it up. It just wouldn't make any sense, and they'd be scratching their head and say your story's comical, right? Clearly there's a necromorph there. He's going to know what to do this time around, and he is a reluctant hero. He was thrust into it initially in Dead Space 2. He was pulled into it in Dead Space. He was thrust into it in Dead Space 1. Pulled into it in Dead Space 2, and then in Dead Space 3 it's continuing. His reputation as someone who's had contact with these markers has gotten wide, and so when the big epidemics starts, what are they going to do? They're going to go to the guy who's the expert, they're going to pull him in there, and he's gone from, I don't want to say antagonist, but he's gone from sort of the everyman to the heroic figure because he is the expert. It's kind of a journey of like Ripley in Alien. She's the expert in the 2nd movie, and therefore people rely on her to guide them, and he's becoming much more the driver of the action rather than a reactor.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you're bringing in another character for the co-op, like John Carver, will we see him? I mean, it's almost like Isaac's a bit of a sort of, he's their go-to guy. So will we see him, John Carver, develop in similar ways, or Will the background be different? And again, bringing in the transmedia approach that is there with Dead Space, will he have that same strength behind him that Isaac did, do you think?
One of the things we set out to do was try to make Carver a true character in the franchise, not someone who's along for the ride, who's dropping in during co-op here or there, a follower, but someone that if you're a fan of the fiction, you're going to want to understand their story. Carver comes from a very different sort of spot in life than Isaac does. He's a soldier by trade. He was a warrior going through these battles against necromorphs when his family was killed and murdered, so that puts a tone to him right off the start. Very hard, very callous to begin with. And through single player, you see him evolve a little bit throughout the game, and you see the journey that he goes on with when he's thrust into this environment, and you can see his reaction to the characters and the settings. But in co-op, you start to really understand the backstory around him, what drives and motivates him. And I think that's one of the biggest draws to me as a gamer in our co-op design, is that you're going to really learn the color around Carver to understand more specifically why his approach to the other members of his party on the planet and whatnot change, because you'll see the experiences that he's experiencing that you may not get in single player. And so co-op, and especially the co-op storytelling, really helps build out Carver as a grounded, real character that I think our fans will like.
And going back to sort of the feeling you get with the previous two games, what sort of challenges did you guys have implementing co-op but maintaining that scare the crap out of you sort of element that we've, like, I mean, that's what people come to expect. They set themselves up for that when they're playing Dead Space game.
You know, Dead Space 1, we did some things differently in Dead Space 1 to Dead Space 2, and we're going to do some things differently in Dead Space 2 to Dead Space 3. It's a natural progression and evolution of the franchise. One of the things I always think about when we're talking about scares and horror is that fear, for a lot of people, for many people, it is all psychological. It lives in your head. What is frightening to you might not be frightening to me, regardless of if I'm in single player or co-op or playing with a rifle or a plasma cutter. You know, fear is subjective, scares are subjective. And so we didn't set out to do anything fundamentally different in single player or co-op other than build up Carver's dementia and the scares of understanding and trying to understand what's going on in the game world on the Carver side. There's these wonderful horror moments that happen for him as part of his interaction with dementia and the markers. But horror is very subjective, and just because you're playing in co-op, if your setting is still dark and quiet or scary, if the partner you're playing with is chatty or not chatty, it is one of those things that we believe that we've created an experience that our fans are going to love and also become more accessible. One of the things that I've often gravitated towards when talking about our game design, especially with horror, is that it is very common for people to go to horror movies or other kinds of media with a friend, because that inherently lowers the tension because you're not by yourself anymore. You can elbow your buddy in your ribs and make a joke. You can stay quiet. It's really up to you how you want to deal with this. And so adapting that to Dead Space, I think for some people, if the game was too frightening, this is an accessibility point to it. If they're a story enthusiast, co-op is another accessibility point. And so it's really what you want to make of it, and however you structure the game experience at your house, at your home, on your couch, that's going to be whatever you want. I believe we created a game that'll help you deliver it as long as you set up your environment appropriately.
Yeah, for sure. We're seeing a lot more, very different necromorphs this time around, or so far from what I've seen. Was that, again, story-driven, or was that something just that's a natural progression when you're doing this kind of game and sort of stepping it up each time the way you guys have?
You know, it's a combination of things. There's always a desire to create new, frightening enemies to throw at players. Our character and our enemy and our combat and controls design team really enjoy creating new experiences, and we have things like transforming and morphing necromorphs this time around that start off in a much more humanoid position. So, you know, there's a natural understanding right away if you're not necessarily familiar with Dead Space about how to attack them. You shoot them in the head, and all of a sudden, they start to do something very different when you do that. And so the story and the fiction doesn't really dictate a lot of the specific character designs other than the standard ones we hold true for Dead Space, which they're made from reanimated flesh of dead people that the marker is driving and building these things. But as far as the gameplay components and designs, we approach those sort of in parallel. We want to make sure we create an enemy that's fun, that keeps you on your toes, but also fits with the game world that we're building.
Yeah. I mean, in the presentation, you guys mentioned you want this to be something memorable for this generation. With the next generation of consoles looming, how did you guys sort of prepare for that? Was that a consideration, or you just focused on where you're at?
You know, I know it's kind of a standardized answer right now, but we've been focused, laser focused on making Dead Space 3 the best game we can make for the console generation that we're on. There are a lot of opportunities ahead of us if people want more Dead Space to really change things around with the next generation of hardware. But right now we are laser focused on making the best experience on this current generation of platforms and PC for the people who want to play it in February, not waiting till next year.
Yeah, right. Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, and looking forward to the game.